Lebanon wine is intertwined with the legendary Chateau Musar, a winery that survived almost a century of woes and obstacles while gaining a worldwide reputation amongst the most authentic fine wines of the world with famed aging potential. I met Marc Hochar a couple of months ago at a masterclass in Germany, just before the latest war in the Middle East broke out. The wines were of course amazing and impactful as I expected, but Marc's gentleman-like aura further elevated the experience with deep thoughts and eye-opening questions. I never took so many notes at a wine tasting before, to be honest. So please listen to our conversation about Lebanon, a truck-fermented vintage, Sergism, what the future might hold for Chateau Musar and much more. Cheers! Thanks for taking the time remotely. Unfortunately this time, because we met I think in October.
Yes. Very nice tasting, actually. Very nice place.
Yeah, at Lake Constance.
Lake Constance, yeah, exactly. I can't remember the name of the restaurant, but there was like beautiful food, like a 1-star Michelin. But it's a while ago. It was a little bit before things started to go a little bit bizarre in my part of the world, and so I start to forget things after a while.
What are you basically responsible for in the winery?
Yes, I tend to say I do everything and nothing. So my brother runs the winery. He's based, in Beirut, but spends a lot of time taking care of the winery, of the wine program, and mostly also of the distribution there locally. I was living abroad for a long time, so I tend to take care of our UK office. We have a UK office that distributes and markets our wines to Europe, to Asia, to Canada, and we have a warehouse in Europe, and we also had one in the UK, and so there's a lot of work to be done on that aspect, because it's difficult to ship directly from Beirut to in small quantities to different locations. So we have a setup with a UK entity. And I also spend a lot of time traveling, doing a lot of the tastings, and representing, I guess, the winery, like the one we had together. And I also do all the other projects that are a bit bizarre and new and different, because my brother's fairly busy taking care of all the operational side. So any new project that comes up that requires a bit more research, that falls into my lap. And these for me are interesting. They're fun, they're challenging sometimes, but they're a necessity of making sure our business evolves and adapts to new requirements. I think one of the latest topics that we've had to deal with that I basically took care of was all the upgrading and all the sustainability and corporate social responsibility. That's a big theme that's coming up now in Northern Europe, and then in the UK, and then the rest of Europe, not yet in the US. And so we had to make sure that our company actually is set up and has all the, I guess, the accreditations that are necessary for that evolution of the business and of the trends that we see in the world.
Because I guess your winery has already lived up to a lot of trends during the 3 generations, right?
Yes, we've had to adapt. I mean, but our winery is old. So it's my grandfather who started it in 1930. So it's been there for a long time. The buildings, the structure also were old. The current winery was built in the 50s and 60s. So obviously a lot of things needed to be upgraded to comply with, I guess, new not regulations, but just new standards of what you would expect in terms of health and safety and other things for the workers, and just general setup of how the health and safety works at the winery. And we hadn't done some upgrades for a while, and so we've done a big project in the last 4 years to upgrade the winery, many of the facilities, and also to upgrade our setup, in line with all these new standards that are required.
The whole winery started basically with your grandfather selling wine to the French army, right?
So it started in the 1930s. Yes, that's the case with my grandfather deciding, after having studied in France. I mean, we're Lebanese, although we have a French name, but we're Lebanese. So he studied in France medicine, but didn't really like it, and then came back to Lebanon after a year just in France, and really loved wine at the time, and decided, okay, wine is what I want to do. And because Lebanon was new as a country, so Lebanon was created, in the 20s at the end of World War One, once the Ottoman Empire was disintegrated, and the British and the French drew up all the borders of the countries of the Middle East as we know them today. And so Lebanon was a new entity, with the French army being posted there in what is called a mandate, not a colony, but a mandate by the French. And so, yes, I think my grandfather liked wine, and that was what he enjoyed, and he decided to produce it. And there was a very obvious taker of his wines, which were the French. And so that helped actually kickstart probably the whole idea, and also the sales. I think there's even some years, I was told by actually my uncle, where they took the whole production. Basically, they came to the winery and said, okay, we need wine. We need wine for the whole of the Levant area, which is where the French were posted at the time. They needed big quantities, and they said, okay, we ask to take everything. Obviously, they paid for it, which is good, but they just took the whole quantity. And then gradually, as the production ramped up and things started to develop locally, then there was also a local market to cater to and to sell to. So that became a combination of the two, until I guess our independence, which was in 1943, when the French left. So they were still there, but not as an army, therefore needing less wine. But then by then we were selling also to the local, to the Lebanese, and that's how it continued.
But the French connection is still very strong, probably also for not only for your family, but also for the winery, right? In terms of grape varieties, also market-wise as well. But the connection to Bordeaux is still probably pretty strong.
So the connection with France is strong generally, yes, always in Lebanon. I mean, we speak French even at home. I think it also drove the reason why we planted mostly red varietals that were from France. Because I think, historically, so we had wines in Lebanon for thousands of years. Then it stopped during the period of Islam. It started again in the mid 1850s with monks starting to plant again. Initially, they brought the vines from Algeria, where the French were also posted. And they realized that in Algeria, and the weather, actually, it did okay. The wines were doing, the grapes were doing fine, and the wines that were created were good, but were based mostly on French varietals because of the connection between Algeria and France. And so eventually that made its way to Lebanon. And so we started planting also Lebanon varietals that came mostly from France, just because of that connection with France. So when my grandfather started, we had phylloxera in the early 1900s. So if there were any reds that were local reds, or as far as we know, they did not survive. So he had to plant again, and so he used the same concept that was used 50 years prior to that, which was bring in French varietals. And so that connection has stayed. And then today, my father studied in Bordeaux. Our winemaker now also studied in Montpellier, so all in France. And so we're used to the Mediterranean terroir, and that's the most, close to us in terms of our hearts and our language, and to some extent our culture as well is France, rather than in any other countries around the Mediterranean. And so that's what makes sense in terms of our blends. We use mostly those varietals. Although we've added lately Tempranillo, for example, to our plantings, and that goes into one new wine that we created a few years ago that has a third roughly of it in Tempranillo, and that's mainly, that was mainly driven by the need to have a varietal that resists to heat, because heat is the biggest issue that we're dealing with.
When did your father take over the winery?
Yeah, so my father took over. So in '59, at least '59, he started getting involved in the winemaking. He was 20 at the time, and gradually, my grandfather asked him, actually asked him whether he could join the winery and help. And initially, my father said no. At least that's what the story says. So he said no a few times, and then eventually he said, "Okay, yes, I'll do it. But if I do it, then you, as in his father, have to leave, or at least leave, as in leave me the reins to do whatever I want to do." Basically, my father had his vision of what he thought the wines should be and how they should be made, and he made quite a few changes, I think, compared to what my grandfather used to do. I think when my grandfather started the winery, he used the help of a cousin of his that was an agronome, and I think they just learned on the spot, I guess, how to make wines, probably. But without probably just on the spot itself, but without actually going to study winemaking anywhere, as far as I know. My father, when he started, was the same. He was an engineer, but he hadn't really studied winemaking. He studied winemaking a few years later, but his approach was to say, okay, if the Phoenicians 6,000 years ago used to make wine in the area, they were probably not using any techniques of, any technology. And therefore, I'm sure we can make wine in a similar way with the same approach, which is what today, the fashion or the trend calls natural winemaking. But that's the vision that my father had, from the late 50s, early 60s on. And so he changed a little bit the way we did our wines. I think it took him 17 years to figure out exactly the formula of what to do, what to blend, when to bottle, and the timing about everything. But the approach of not using yeasts anymore for fermentation, of not filtering the wines, of not finding the wines, at least not the reds. All of that started, as soon as he arrived, so in the '59, because that was his vision, and I think that's why he probably asked my grandfather to step away from the winemaking so that he could incorporate and really make the wines the way he thought was the right way to do it.
Because Serge, your father, he made the impression of a deep thinker and almost like a philosopher to me. Listened to a couple of interviews and watched a couple of videos with him, and he has looked at wine as an important part of human culture, if I'm not mistaken, and not as a business mean.
Yes, so my father was, as you say, a bit of a philosopher in that sense, and he used wine as a way of learning about life, about communication. In a sense, wine is alive. It's it depends on how you treat it, obviously. But if you treat it the way he did and his approach to winemaking, the whole concept was to keep the wine alive and as a living product that evolves, that changes, that goes through ups and downs, that ages better in some periods and less well in other periods. So it's similarly almost to a human being. And so gradually, as he was developing this approach of producing the wines, I think his approach of how to talk about the wines and the whole philosophy and his enjoyment also of the wines also developed in the same way. And so, every aspect of life, in a way, he would just bring it back to how wine would behave. And how wine would behave would also be, in the same way, an example of how life could be, for us, as people. And so there was always a parallel between the two that he created. And I think that was what effectively touched a lot of people in the way he spoke. And also that's what allowed him to connect with people, because he wasn't preaching or being a philosopher. He was talking about wine, and then you just could interpret whatever he said about wine with a pinch of salt, or in a slightly different angle. And there were different ways of interpreting any sentence that he would say, depending on what you applied it to, whether you applied it to people, to relationships, to life, to work, to all the things that matter to people. And this is, I think, where wine makes a big difference, is that it's because it's a living product. It's linked to senses. It's linked to pleasure. It has all the features that impact to some extent life. So a lot of his sentences were often could be interpreted in so many different ways, and this is what made them. Usually, we call them Sergisms, which were just a way of him expressing himself, and then whoever listened to or read that quote would have to think about it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times until you figured out all the different angles of what it could mean.
But I'm sure you inherited a similar talent in communication. Also, when we were in Germany, I mean, you spoke very eloquently. That was a perfect representation also for your wines, because I think your wines also are very elegant. I think you used this word a couple of times as well about the wines. What is it for you the most important thing if you make a Chateau Musar, or if you make with your brother a Chateau Musar? What should it be representing to you? What emotions, or what thoughts, or what philosophy?
It's a good question. It's very broad, but I think what we want in our wines is to have probably the best possible representation of life in all the good, and also sometimes the bad, because life is not always good. I mean, it goes through cycles. And what we look for in our wines is this ability of a wine to surprise you, to find things that were there. Maybe you find after 10, 15, 20 minutes, or 2 or 3 days, or after you open the bottle, or a few years later, you find things in the wines that you don't find today. And the idea is that you want to have a wine that has life, therefore that is dynamic, and that has this ability to surprise you. Now, surprise should also be linked. Surprise is one thing, which is this life component that I'm talking about. The other thing that we look for is, as you said, is always elegance, and elegance is a very personal, I guess, aspect. And then, what I consider elegant might be very different from what you consider elegant, or what, another drinker might consider elegant, or another viewer, or, anybody who's just not only tasting wines. But elegance is a very personal assessment. And it's linked to what you think is refined, is more subtle, is not too bland, and not too rustic, and so we look for that in our wines, and I guess this is the beauty of what I guess my father managed to create in the 17 years where he figured out how to make our Chateau Musar red, between the 1959 and until 1977. This is how long it took him really to figure out his style, his formula, his process as to how to make the wines. And the idea was to create those wines that are elegant. I call them, as they get older, I call them also ethereal wines, basically, or epiphany wines. These are wines where you take a bottle, you taste it, you see how it evolves over 1, 2, 3 hours, and then especially older vintages, and then you realize, okay, there's something a bit special about this wine, because it's almost like you get into a meditative state where you smell things, you feel things, you just are connected with the environment around you. It doesn't happen with every bottle, of course, but sometimes you're just in the right setting, in the right circumstances, in the right mood, with the right bottle. And when that happens, all of a sudden, yeah, it's almost like a state. We're lucky that we've had, I've met a few people throughout the last 10, 15 years that I've been working with my family who had their epiphany bottle of Chateau Musar. And it's that bottle that usually led them either to change their path in terms of careers or to discover a completely new aspect of wine. Or people who tell me, once I've had my first bottle, then, a third of my cellar is now Musar because it has something special that, other bottles don't have. I'm sure other wineries also can have that. It's just, one person finds one thing in his life at one point that he likes. And then we're lucky enough to have, I think, a style of wine and a signature linked to our winery and also our terroir that makes it a bit special.
Yeah. I guess my wife is one of those people because just after she tasted the first Chateau Musar white, she said, I'm going to be a Chateau Musar collector. So you convinced her for sure.
Oh, wow. Okay. Was that at the tasting that we had together or was that before?
No, that was the tasting, yes.
Okay. Wow. Well, I'm very happy to hear that. And yeah, our Chateau Musar white is so unique and so different. This is where I was talking about life earlier. And then, sometimes you meet a person or you meet a circumstance or you taste something that's, opens a new door to how you perceive taste, pleasure, your senses, your everything. And when that happens, I mean, it's very humbling for us. And so I'm very happy that, that was the experience that your wife had with our white.
Me too. And that was also a moment for me as well, or convincing moment that your wines always, kind of trigger some kind of deep emotion or deeper emotion than most wines in the market. And I think you are most famous for your reds, probably for the Chateau Musar red, but your wines and the Rosé wines also have such a unique character and such a concentration without being bold or musculous. That it's very appealing to a lot of people who I think may have greater affinity to elegance rather than muscle. And I think this is a very, very rare winery in this sense as well. But can I ask you a little bit about the Bekaa Valley? Because I'm sitting now in Tyrol in Austria, you are sitting in London. So if you want to take me to the Bekaa Valley, and if I close my eyes, how should I imagine that place where you grow these beautiful grapes at?
So the Bekaa Valley is okay. It's a valley, but usually people associate the valley with a place that is not necessarily very high in altitude. You would think of valley as something which is close to, sea level. But actually it's not. In this case, it's a valley that's at 1,000 meters of altitude, and it's surrounded by two chains of mountains that go up to 3,000 meters on both sides, almost. So you're really in the valley at 1,000, and on two sides you see mountains going up 2,000 meters, and not in a very big distance. It's not very far because Lebanon is really a small country. Now the whole width of the valley is, I think at the maximum it's 15 kilometers. On average, it's between 5 and 10 kilometers wide. So it's really not that big. And so you feel you're almost in a cocoon, nestled between these two mountains. It's the breadbasket of Lebanon in a sense that most of the agriculture is there. There's also agriculture on the mountains themselves, but the valley floor is the most fertile, at least for normal agriculture. And then as you get to the sides of the valley towards the beginning of the mountains, there's less clay, there's less water, there's more limestone. There's a big component of limestone in Lebanon. And as you get to that sides of the mountains, the limestone kicks in even more. And this is ideal actually for wine growing in terms of soil. So when you're in the Bekaa Valley, it's one of the few parts of Lebanon actually which is flat, because all the rest is really mountains. So compared to the rest of the country, you feel a little bit more like you have space, you can breathe, you can walk and have a view that's extended. And it's also the place where the Romans 2,000 years ago, more than 2,000 years ago, decided to build the only temple dedicated to Bacchus, the god of wine. And they built it in Baalbek because of the history of winemaking that existed at the time, probably in the region, and also they chose that site. There's big debates. You have the theories about it being a site for extraterrestrial landings, because they use these huge blocks of 20 tons, 25 tons of stones. I don't think that's the case, but they chose a spot that is very unique in terms of its positioning, and it felt right to them. And I think when you look at the way the temple was built and the angles and the directions, basically the main temple was dedicated to Jupiter, which is the god of the sun. And then on the day of the god of the sun, which is 21st of June, the way the sun comes in, when the sun comes up, it goes up above the mountains, and then it would hit directly straight into the temple in a straight line, exactly in the middle of the whole construction. So yes, at the time, people had ways of building and positioning their important buildings linked to nature, linked to the sun, linked to to natural things, and so the fact that they decided to do it in Baalbek in the Bekaa Valley for us, is an important factor, because they felt that it was a beautiful place that deserved such an important palace, such an important temple.
Do you think this kind of deep historical rooting and also maybe this kind of vibration what you have in the soil, I don't know how spiritual you are or how religious maybe even, but do you think it somehow kind of resonates all with the wines and also with the local people still?
I don't think religion on its own would drive or explain anything of these. I think what would, however, is I think it's the nature of the people, and what Lebanon represents as a country today, but also as a region or space at the time. And we're talking 2, 3, 4, 5,000 years ago. The reason you had such big culture for such a long time, dating back thousands of years, was that the land was plentiful. The land of milk and honey. This is how people refer to the Lebanon, or the region of Lebanon. And it's not because we have cows that do milk or bees that make honey. It's more, I think, there are more symbols. Milk is the motherland that provides. Therefore, it's vegetables, it's fruits, it's agriculture. So for me, the milk is just the fact that the land can give, and then you can sustain and support yourself. And honey, for me, is the sweetness of life. And if you think that 3, 4, 5,000 years ago, if it was too cold, it was difficult to live. Although we have mountains, you had seasons. It wasn't as cold as in Europe. And therefore, it was a beautiful place to live because the weather was good, and the way of life was good. So these are more symbols that I associate to the region. And when you are in Lebanon, and Although, you know, I grew up in Lebanon and I left because of the civil war and different things that happened at the time. It's very bizarre, but when you go to Lebanon, or at least I go to Lebanon, and although this wasn't the case at the beginning, when I grew and got a little bit older and wiser, you go to Lebanon and all of a sudden you feel this urge to live as in to appreciate life, and not to wait for the future, not necessarily to, you know, to plan for the future, but just to enjoy life and its moments. And it's, you know, very maybe simple or basic moments, but there's something about this land and the impression that you get once you're in Lebanon about just wanting to enjoy, you know, life, you know, at the time, on the spot, at the present. And that's not something that I feel anywhere else. I've lived a bit everywhere in my life. I've lived in, you know, in Paris, I've lived in London, I've lived a bit in New York and Dubai. But I never felt that same thing or that urge to, you know, to enjoy life and enjoy the present as I do in Lebanon. Is it religious? No. Is it mystical? No. I don't know. It's very difficult to explain. But it's a feeling I think that a lot of people share when they go to Lebanon, even from abroad, and they feel, okay, in Lebanon there's something special. I don't know if it's the people, if it's the energy of the space, the place. It's but it happens. That's the beauty.
I think it's not really religious, it's very human, I think. And that's why you kind of match the perfect industry with that in the wine industry, because it's also kind of about pleasure, right? And also about emotions and just kind of siege the day kind of feeling. And in the Bekaa Valley, I imagine if you are almost 1,000 meters in altitude and obviously not the Alps surrounding you, so you don't have too much cooling influence, but you are at altitude in a kind of Mediterranean climate, if I'm not mistaken. Do you have problems with precipitation and the lack of rain, and maybe even the lack of humus, or is it more like an advantage for you because it naturally reduces yields and maybe gives a greater concentration
that we need? Yeah, so it's like everything in life. There's the yin and the yang, the positive and the negative about you know, everything. So we usually get snow in the winter. We get rain. There's actually quite a lot of rain normally, but the rain is concentrated and the snow during the winter period. So usually it starts raining, you know, from November and goes to maybe March. And obviously you have the winter season with a bit of snow in the middle. Maybe up to April. And then afterwards, you typically don't have any rain. So we're talking April to August, September, maybe October. So what does it mean? It means that we should have enough water in the aquifers, so below the soil, for our grapes to our vines to find enough water to be able to produce the grapes. We don't irrigate, you know, whatever we do at the winery, at the vineyard is organic. So we don't irrigate, we don't have pesticides, etc. But we let the vines struggle. They need to figure out how to get water, which means that they end up with, I guess, much more concentration in the few clusters that manage to make it, you know, through the season and until the harvest. That gives us much more concentration, lower yields, and enough water, and not too much. Now, the issue with I guess the last 10 to 15 years we've had is this global warming. That means more extreme weather patterns. So we're getting heat waves much more often that hit us anywhere between July, August, or September, either earlier in the harvest or later. And so that impacts obviously our production quantities. It impacts the ripening, the time we need to harvest. And so we're seeing a lot of variation in vintages. even more so probably than we used to, because of the impact of global warming, smaller grapes, less juice in general. That's the biggest issue that we're dealing with. But the fact that we also don't have water, between April and October means less humidity. Less humidity means less pests, less problems. So again, it's the yin and the yang. You can't have everything. It's I call like a life and everything in life that you do a package deal. You take the good and the bad, or the less good and the less bad together. And so we just learn to live with it and deal with it. We adapt. We've introduced Tempranillo, as I said last time. As I said earlier, we spend a bit more time planting Cinsault because it resists better to heat. So we have to adapt a little bit. And we have the chance on the whites to have two local varietals, Obaid and Magwah, that go into our Chateau Musar White and our Chateau Musar Rosé, that really almost do not care about how much heat there is. They ripen late. They ripen usually in October after reds. When they ripen, they reach 12.5 degrees alcohol maximum. They don't go higher, which is absolutely fantastic because it means we don't have the same rush to harvest. We just wait for the phenolics to really, and the ripening to happen well without being too concerned about high alcohol levels. And they just, they just manage most of the year. Some years we don't get them, but the years we get them, it's absolutely fantastic that the local varietals really play a big role, I think, in creating wines that are very unique to us, and that's the beauty about having local varietals versus imported varietals.
They had the means and also the motivation and time to adapt probably to your climate, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think they probably existed at the time of the Phoenicians. We're talking many thousands years ago. And initially we thought they were linked, or they were the ancestors of some of the varietals that we find in Europe. But then with DNA, we figured out that they're not. They're actually really local with no link to anything else. And whenever we plant white varietals that we brought in from Europe, so we have in our Musar Jeune White, we have Viognier Vermentino Chardonnay, they ripen so quickly. In early August, they are at 13 and a half. If we wait 2 weeks, 10 days, they're at 15 alcohol. Obaid and Magwah in October, so 2 months later, are at 12. So yeah, they know how to adapt. They are, this is Darwin, this is the survival of nature. And in a sense, this is the beauty of these two varietals in the terroir that we have. Would they deal very well in other terroirs? I don't know. But for our terroir and our climate and our weather, they're perfect. And they make wines that are, unusual, but that have a soul, a real soul.
That's true. Are there maybe other wineries or other winemakers who are interested in these kind of varieties? Maybe linked to global warming?
Look, we've been using them for, when my grandfather started, we started using Magwah at the beginning. So we're talking about 90 years ago. We introduced Arbeide in the 80s into the mix. We used to have Arbeide for our Musar Jeune, for our entry-level wines, or Cuvée Musar was called at the time. But then we eventually started blending the two. And I think with the trailblazer that Musar did across the world in terms of putting, I guess, wines from Lebanon on the map, we showed that these varietals can actually produce great wines. And I think in the last 10, 15 years, 20 years, there's been a flurry of new wineries that came up in Lebanon. And the interest in local grapes has increased. I think people have seen that we can make great wines with these varietals. And so, a lot of people are now using them. I think nobody uses them as a blend as we do, as we've done for the last 50, 60 years. They use them rather as single varietals. We use it as a blend. We actually don't even mention it on the label, but it, for people who know Musar, it's, this is how it is in the label. We have this old French system where we talk more about the winery on the label than the varietals. It's not like the New World that focuses mostly on the varietals rather than regions or villages, like in the European label modeling system. But yeah, so you can find more and more of these two local varietals. Again, usually either one or the other with some of the other wineries.
You also do everything by hand in the winery and also in the vineyard. I mean, not necessarily in the winery, but in the vineyard, right?
Yes.
And you also do have only bush wines, or?
Yeah, so we don't irrigate, and we have bush vines, and everything is done by hand. Lebanon has so for us, we don't want to irrigate because this is not what we believe is the right way to produce great wines. Even though it would help us in years where we have droughts or where we have like heat waves, it would really allow us to avoid losing 20, 30 or more % of our production. But if you really want concentration and intensity of the taste of the flavors, that's the steps that we follow, which is no irrigation. And then everything is done by hand. Indeed, yes. The probably one of the things that's different compared to other wineries also is that our vineyards are not located around the winery. For historical reasons, my grandfather created the winery in an old castle called the Musar Castle, which is the origin of the name Musar. That was owned by his cousin, and that was just north of Beirut in the mountains. But the vineyards are in the Bekaa Valley, which is where, that's again, as I said, the breadbasket. This is where, the grapes grow the best and other fruits and vegetables. And so that's a 3-hour truck drive. And that was created even at the time. I guess probably trucks did not work as well or not as fast. So probably might have been 4 or 5 hours at the time. And with the roads that were probably not as good. Now it's still a 3-hour truck drive. And that's not usual for a setup. That's not how you would set it up if you had to set it up today. But if we were to change anything in our setup, we'd probably end up with different wines. If we create a winery in the Bekaa Valley closer to the vineyards and try to redo the same thing as we do now, we'd probably end up with different wines because our fermentation is a natural fermentation. It's yeasts that are on the skin of the grapes, but it's also probably the space in Razir at the winery itself today, and probably the air, the ambient air. This all contributes. This is where with wine, like with life, there are many things that come into that have causes and consequences that you don't know, and you don't know what started a certain process of fermentation. You don't know exactly if one particular bacteria or yeast is local or is not, is in the air. Or would it be the same if it's at a different altitude, at a different temperature? We don't know. Since we're relying on nature and not using something that we're adding, nature is everything. And therefore, yeah, even if we were, I think, to move the winery 300 meters and build a new one, just bigger somewhere else, in the same village, probably would be different. Yeah, and this is life. This is the uncertainty, but also the beauty about life.
Like as you said, maybe you wouldn't set it up like this today, but also optimization not always leads to the most memorable experiences in your life, and probably not the most impactful experiences. And also, I think your wines are proving that not to walk the easiest path or not to walk the most obvious path is certainly sometimes bring
brings a bit more impact and emotion and more memorable cultural assets. Which are your ones?
Yes, I think. I mean, you said it right, Mathieu, but the thing is, you don't know also. When you start, you don't know. We started like this because I think my grandfather did not have a choice. He had no money when he started the winery. He had a space which was his cousin's castle, where the cellars were empty, and he said, "Okay, I'll just use the cellars downstairs." And because it's in a village, there was no choice also but to plant somewhere else. And if you're going to plant somewhere else and use grapes, and in the region where there was no space for agriculture, then you have to go somewhere else. So some of the decisions are forced. They're forced. They come with just natural events and natural or things that seem natural at the time, and then and they lead you to a certain path, and you don't necessarily make a decision that's with knowing all the consequences that it has. But this is the beauty again about surprises, about life, about the unexpected, but in a positive way. And it's the unexpected that usually hopefully brings you sometimes bad surprises, but also some good ones.
And also that was the case probably in the 84 vintage, which was the truck-fermented vintage, as you said, right?
Yes. So 84, because of the war and the checkpoints and the issues at the time, it was very difficult to get the grapes from the vineyard to the winery. And what usually took 3 hours as a truck drive took 5 days because of having to bring. Actually, we harvested late because before that it wasn't possible. So we harvested in October, a month and a half later than usual, and it hadn't rained, so we were very lucky that year. And also, we drove the trucks to the south, or one truck to the south, and it took a boat to the north, and then made it to the winery. Another truck went north through the Cedar Mountains in the north of Lebanon, and then came down, and both of them arrived after 5 days. So this is the truck fermented vintage, I call it, but a vintage that initially wasn't a wine. It was more of a Madeira. We never really sold it at year 7, which is usually now 6, which is usually the period after which we sell our wines, because it just did not behave like a wine, and we didn't want to put something on the market that wasn't ready or that could last over time, and we had no clue how this vintage would behave. But after 25 years, we tasted it again, and actually my father offered it to a Madeira lover who really liked Madeiras, and told him, I'll show you my Madeira. And then so he actually sent a few bottles, and then eventually some bottles ended up in a tasting in the US, and when they were opened by our importer to prepare the tasting, he smelled them and then said, this wine is completely off. So he just focused on the other vintages. But he knows our wines very well, so he came back to the wine after the tasting, at the end of the tasting, and then smelled them again. And then by then they had really opened up, and so he poured them to everybody at the tasting. And that was, I think, voted the most interesting, or more, interesting is probably not the right word, but the most, a wine full of experiences that people had not expected. And so as a result, we started tasting it a bit more. Then we had the request to have it at a tasting in Hong Kong. And then when I started opening it, I remember at that tasting in Hong Kong, I opened the bottle and I smelled the wine, and it's bizarre, but it's like a Sauterne, like a white Sauterne, like a sweet one. And then so I taste it, and it doesn't taste at all like a sweet wine. It has a bit of sweetness because it's a late harvest. And then we taste it, and over 2 hours, the wine just evolves. It smelled like a Sauterne at the beginning, then eventually it moves to port features, probably because it was harvested so late, probably the higher alcohol, maybe the truck fermentation process, I don't know. And eventually, after an hour, the acidity starts to pick up, and you start to taste it more, and it gets closer to a wine. It's a fascinating journey to taste that wine, because it's so unusual compared to what you expect from wine. But it shows you that, even, with the very hard conditions in which that vintage was born, and it seems like nature always comes back, at least with the wines that we have. I don't know, will it come back with all of the wines? I don't know. Our wines tend to have this ability to age, which is fantastic. And so if you wait long enough, you eventually get to something which is beautiful. And so 84, yeah, it took 30 years to get to that point. But when you open this bottle today, yeah, it's a testimony to life, to the resilience of life, and of the grape, and of the juice, and what it can create. A very, again, unusual, not a typical classic Musar. A great story, but also if you taste the wine on its own and you understand where it's coming from, then you really appreciate also what it represents.
You are also famous for your long Elevage. I think it used to be even longer than now. I mean, not the 30 years, but you had with the 84 and also I think with the 74. But can you talk a little bit about this process and how it was evolved? And why do you think it's the right way to do it still?
Our process is we harvest every varietal separate, every plot of land separate. We ferment in cement vats because this is where we feel that the wines can have less of an impact from the container. So we don't use stainless steel for reds, only cement. And after fermentation, it's kept in storage in vats of cement for 1 year. Afterwards, it goes through wood, and the wood that we use is only 10% new wood for the reds in particular, because we don't want to give any taste of wood. We just want to use the wood as a container where you have some micro-oxygenation that happens. And so that's the way in a way, you're vaccinating your wine to get used to a bit of oxygenation, which is going to happen when you're in the bottle. And because when the wine is in the bottle, there's a bit of air below the cork, and therefore, that process of wood allows, I think, the wines to build a bit of complexity, but also, to learn how to deal with oxygen. At the end of 2 years, we then blend. This is the part where we have to agree. Meaning, obviously it used to be my father at the time who would take the last decision and who would make the choices at the beginning. Then my brother and our winemaker Tarek joined in their mid-90s, early 90s, and they learned from him and spent a lot of time with him. And so in the 2014 was the last vintage that my father did. Was it the last year? So it was like a 2-year vintage before. So 2012 was probably his last blending. But then after, the idea was that we would, when we blend, we look for the signature of Musar, even though it's not necessarily what I call the best wine. It's a very difficult process because we taste, let's say my father would have tasted something and preferred a certain blend. I would taste something different or like something different, Tarek something different, my brother something different. But usually we would agree on not necessarily what is the best or the blend that each of us prefers, but we would agree on what we think is the blend that represents Musar the best, as in what we think is the best signature of Musar. And again, it might not be the best wine at the time of tasting it, but it's what we think is the best representation of the identity of our wines, and probably what the wines will, how the wines will evolve and get better over time. Because, when you're blending, you're not blending to taste straight away and to drink straight away, but you're blending for a wine that's going to be tasted, anywhere from 5 years later or 4 years later until, 55 or 65 years later. I don't know. And so it's for the future. So you have to imagine where the wines evolve and where they get to. And that's a gamble. Every tasting is a gamble, and if you and I, Mate, were together at the winery and we, I gave you all the different vats, all the different varietals, and I tell you, okay, let's, you make a blend, I make a blend, we of course will end up with a different blend. Which one is the better one? We won't know. And even if we know at the time, or we think we know at the time, the real test is going to be 30 years later. How are the two wines going to be 30 years afterwards? And that's the biggest challenge, and I guess the biggest gamble. And we gamble every year, in a sense, and we make what we think is the best possible combination. But other options are always possible. And so once we've done our blend, the wine goes back into cement vats for 1 year, then it's bottled at year 3, and then historically it stayed 4 years in our cellars. So we released at year 7. Now we release at year 6 because we had 2 years. We had the 2015 vintage that had a very low production. So we were forced to release 2 vintages at the same time, 14 and 15. And so now we release after year 6 instead of year 7. So that's the Elevage. And then our wines need usually 18 to 20 years really to evolve, to get to what I call to shed some of the fruit component, the fresh fruit component that you have in the wines when they're young, and to move away from pure fruit to move to, to earth, to animal, to everything else apart from fruit, which is, to be honest, what I look for in our wines. I don't look for fruit in our wines. I look for anything else. And it takes a bit of time. Usually, I would recommend, 15 to 20 years, depending on the vintage.
And I think also this long elevage and also the ageability of your wines, it's a very unique attribute and character on today's market, because most people drink almost everything too young. Consumers also are looking for the fruitiness in a wine, which I think it's a very, or too one-dimensional, to put it mildly. And also the spiciness which your wines always possess, and this deep kind of sudden ripeness, because it's still present in your wine, I think, but without the opulence and without the kind of exotic sweetness. And these unique combination of your grape varieties, I'm talking about the reds now, this is also probably very singular in the wine world. Can you talk a little bit about these varieties and how do they behave together, and maybe what the future brings with Tempranillo and also maybe other varieties?
Yeah, so for the Chateau Red, so we use Cinsault, Carignan, Cabernet Sauvignon, roughly a third each. I say roughly because I call it the Lebanese third, meaning that a Lebanese third could mean 33, 34, 35, 30, 28. It's not a perfect science. And it shouldn't be, because it's not only about the actual number. What you realize, we realized, not at the time of doing the blending, but later, is that some vintages will have more of a dominance of a particular varietal in terms of how the wines behave. So a wine that is a bit more dominant in Cabernet will tend to stay on the fruit longer, will age more slowly, will not show as much of the earthy components early on. I mean, it will wait 20, 25 years, even more. Whereas a varietal or vintage, which is more Cinsault dominant, will be lighter in body, maybe will shed the fruit component a bit earlier, maybe will show animal sides faster, Carignan as well. And you realize that it's not the percentages. It's just how well a certain varietal has ripened versus the others. It's like you have a race of, let's say, 3 varietals that each at a third, but one has ripened better, therefore it takes over, and then it dominates the vintage. And so you can have a year where you have very good ripening all along the summer, no issues at all. Every varietal ripens at its peak, and you pick them in those conditions. And if that is the case, even if you have 30% Cabernet rather than 33, Cabernet will take over because it's such a masculine and dominant varietal. So the percentage doesn't mean much. It's really how well it ripened that year. And this is why you end up with vintages that are so different at Musar. It's because it's a blend. I don't think you have a bad vintage of Musar, unless we messed it up. I think 92 we messed it up. We had a problem with some vats, and it all ended up by being distilled and going into Arak. But if not, you end up with years that are very different because either people like vintages that are more lighter in body, more elegant, and people will tend to go towards vintages where Cinsault is more dominant or more expressive in the vintage. Other people prefer much bolder, bigger structures. They'll go for vintages that are a bit more Cabernet dominant. So all these vintages are different, but none of them are bad. And this is where what's interesting is when we did the tasting, I think when we tasted a few vintages, and usually at the end, what I do is I always ask, if you had to vote for one wine, and I ask the whole group, who likes what. And it's not that you end up with 90% liking one vintage and 10% or 5% liking. It's really balanced. It's usually, if you have 5 wines, you'll have probably close to 20% per wine. Close to, it depends obviously on the age of the wines. But so there's no uniform taste that pleases everybody. Everybody tastes different, and so with Musar, you as a taster, you can always find a vintage that you will like, either because you like younger versus older, or because you like bolder versus lighter, and that depends on the vintage and the varietals that have dominated that year. And so this is what's, I think, a bit particular or special about the blending component, is that you don't have bad years, you just have different years.
I think your wines emit this kind of low intervention philosophy, or this kind of laissez-faire kind of approach, but without the naughtiness, because low intervention, as you already mentioned, is gaining a lot of popularity, or has been gaining a lot of popularity in recent years. But a lot of winemakers maybe get it wrong, or maybe just go in a rough way and focus on the low intervention and not on the taste or on the final fineness of the wine, so to say. And it's maybe the head and the tail confusion. How often do you taste similar wines than yours, and what are you looking for in other wines if you want to drink something else other than Chateau Musar? Yeah.
It's a good question. So what I don't look for necessarily the same varietals or the same flavors. I'm not interested in replicating, or finding something that's comparable to Musar in terms of flavor profile. Because I know Musar, and it's I'm happy to taste other things. So I don't want to try to to taste something that's going to be close to what we do. But what I'm interested in are wines that have this ability to evolve. I find that evolution in a wine is what makes the wines interesting for me. You might get tastes that are completely different, that are probably not what I would navigate to normally. But if I find a wine that has the ability to surprise me, because it starts somewhere, it evolves somewhere else, it changes, and it's always dynamic. For me, that means that there's a journey in terms of tasting that bottle. And if there's a journey, there's interest, there's curiosity, at least on my part. And therefore it attracts me. Does it mean necessarily that I would drink that bottle all the time? No. Does it mean that I will remember that bottle? Probably yes. And this is where character, identity, signature that's particular either to a terroir or to a winemaker, really kicks in. And it's and it's that evolution that I'm looking for. And the thing is, usually you realize, or at least I've realized with our wines, that a lot of that evolution, that ability to evolve in the glass, usually comes also with age. And I say usually, because it depends on the varietals. You take a Pinot that's very young, but, very young, let's say 10, 15 years old. It's not very old in the Musar world, but that's already quite old in Pinot. But you can have like beautiful things, even when the wines are relatively young, and an evolution, etc. But I found that usually in slightly older wines, you have this bigger ability to evolve and to change and to surprise you in the glass, and that's the part where I really enjoy. And so that's what I look for. And where do I find it? It depends. Depends.
You usually drink red or white wine?
Well, it depends with what. So dinner usually it will be reds. But I noticed that I tend to go now a bit more for whites than reds. It's probably, I don't know, it's because if I live more in Germany or not, or it's just also depends on the food. I think I tend to eat less meat than I used to, so therefore I tend to combine more whites than with what I eat. But it really depends also on what I'm pairing it with.
And you also make a very unique kind of rosé, and it also had the surprising element that it became fresher with age. Also, like your white wines, they almost like taste younger with like the older vintages taste younger than the newer ones almost. It's unbelievable kind of character of a white or even a rosé wine.
So we make a rosé, a jeune rosé, which is a combination of saignée and press, because this is how we control color and taste. The jeune rosé is Cinsault 80% and Mourvèdre 20%. The Chateau Musar Rosé, on the other hand, which is made from local grapes, Aubert des Miroirs, white grapes, and 3% of Cinsault, these are pressed together. So at the stage where they're still grapes, we combine the white grapes with a little bit of red grapes, and we press. So we get a little bit of color, a little bit of the component from the Cinsault red. And then the juice goes into barrels and is fermented. It's a little bit unusual to make a rosé. So I call our rosé maybe a white in disguise, because it's 97% almost white juice or white grapes. But it creates wines that have an ability to age and that are extremely complex, a little bit similar to our Chateau Musar white, because it's almost similar. And so the rosé, it's very interesting to see how 3% of the red grape component really changes the wines. It's usually our Chateau Musar white released after, it used to be 7, now it's 6 years. They need time because they tend to be a little bit austere when they're a bit younger. But we realized that, with a little bit of Cinsault in it to make our Chateau Musar rosé, the wines are ready to drink after 2.5, 3 years. And so it's, again, it comes back to this component I was talking about earlier about life and, unexpected things. And then you realize that, a small tweak, and then, you change the nature of the wine. But it is a rosé that can be drunk young. And as it gets older, it's like most of our, reds, whites, rosé, they go through a process of what I call a settling. Settling is when a wine, when the wine is young, it's a little bit brash. It's like a younger adolescent who's trying to either prove who he is or to try to impress with maybe bigger bigger aromatics or bigger acidity or bigger whatever, or tannins, whatever components that's specific to the wine. And when the wines get older, they start to what I call settle, which means that they integrate better. You're not talking about seeing spikes. If you were to draw a graph of how the wine, they no more spikes. It starts to be rounder, smoother. And that's the settling component that happens with the wines, and depends at which age. And when it settles, all of a sudden, when you're tasting the wines, you don't taste acidity separate from sugar, separate from tannins. You just taste one wine. It just integrates better. And it becomes much more fluid, much more the fluidity of the wines. It's just there. And that's why and in most of our cases we tend to recommend to people to wait a little bit for our wines, because I find that it's a better drinking experience and tasting experience once the wines have reached that settled part. I think it happens faster with the whites than with the reds, but it depends again on the vintage.
You still have a great library of older vintages, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Going back to the 40s, we sell to some of the 50s, but we have our wines. We keep wines and still sell them at the winery. Less so in the world because it's a little bit more difficult, and we still sell wines to the mid-90s around the world. That's easy to find. From the 80s, 70s, and 60s, you can find them, but it's a bit harder. And these wines usually we recondition before we sell them. So at the winery, if we were to release like 74, we would typically open the bottle, taste it, top it up, put a new cork and then ship it. And all of that takes a lot of time. During COVID, it was delayed. So we have less and less of these older vintages available to sell because it requires so much work. But yes, so we have a library of very old wines. We opened, when we had our US visitors a couple of months ago, I found a bottle that was in the cellar in the wine cave at home, at my mother's and my father's place, which basically had a very old label, the old label dating back from my grandfather, so which is a bit much more Gothic in terms of its design, but with no vintage. We couldn't see the vintage. And so we actually opened it on the night we had the dinner at our house, without knowing what vintage it was. Amazing experience. I was, we opened it, we tasted it. We're like 18 of us, and had a 20-minute chat about it. We had, in terms of flavors, hoisin sauce, barbecued chicken, not barbecued pork, lots of flavors, and there was a freshness in this wine that completely was outstanding. And so I thought initially it was a 1950. Turned out once I did a bit more research into which bottles had made it to my father's private cellar, turns out it was a 48 actually. So 48 produced by my grandfather. And an amazing experience. I didn't know what to expect. Usually we decant our wines. I didn't decant this one because I had no clue how it would behave, since it was, clearly older than what we usually drink. But an outstanding experience. I was completely, surprised as to how fresh that wine was. And that was a 75-year-old wine.
Was it the last bottle from the vintage?
No, I think we still have some. At the winery. Yeah, we found. I think the story of that one is that 20 years ago we were doing some works at refurbishments at the winery, and we found a room that had bottles, and so most of them were set in another place. But my father ended up by keeping one bottle in his private cellar that he never opened, and I think he probably had the vintage in a book, but on the wine itself, and I couldn't find that book, so I just couldn't figure out which vintage it was. So it was a bit of a challenge to open it in front of our importers without knowing how good it would taste and what it was with vintage. But it turned out to be an amazing experience.
Mm. In the future, with the increased and maybe more stable demand, do you sell more wines and maybe have less wine for your library?
Yes, definitely. I mean, what's happened is that we used to sell around 70% of a vintage and keep 30%. Depended on the vintage. Some vintage we produced more, so we had even more than that. And then would sell that remaining stock over 20, 30, 40 years. Today, with the demand we have, even for our young wine, for our young, as in like the current vintage of the Chateau Musar Red, we're closer to 90% being sold in the first year, 95 sometimes. So it means, yeah, that there's less wine available to sell afterwards. So what we do is we try to protect a bit of stock, so we don't make it available or we increase its price, just because we want to be able to sell that vintage 20 years from now, And generally we produce 200,000 bottles a year. I'd say that's the average. If we keep 10, 15,000 bottles and you want to sell these 10, 15,000 bottles over 20 years, that's less than 1,000 bottles per year for the whole world. Even then, we wouldn't release that much. So there's not as much wine available for the library anymore as it used to be.
That means it's going to be a good investment.
It means that if people want to be able to taste the wines when they're older, either they'll be able to find it later, but it's going to be very rare, or they're going to have to collect. Basically buy when the wines are young and collect them like they do with all the rest of the wines. Now, we still have, 10,000 bottles, let's say, of a vintage. And so we are still able to release some if there's special events, if there's special tastings that we need to do, they are still there. But before, any vintage of Musar you could find almost anywhere at any time. And this is no longer the case. It's available, but in much smaller quantities.
And I heard that you also plan to do maybe coastal plantings.
Yeah, on the coast. So yeah, we did start. So most of our vineyards historically have been in the Bekaa Valley. We actually found a piece of land above Byblos. Byblos is on the coastline. It's a very old city. It's actually the second oldest continuously lived in city in the world. I believe after Jericho, and it's roughly 10 or 11,000 years of continuous living. And Byblos used to be a port of the Phoenicians, a very important port for boats, and so for trade, including the trade of wine. And we found this plot of land that is called the Way of the Vine in Arabic. And it wasn't planted with vines, it was just scrubs and bushes and everything. But a beautiful piece of land at 400 meters of altitude. And so, yeah, we took that 6 years ago, planted it mostly with whites, but also with some red, some Cinsault. And so that's our first venture into planting on the western side of the Mount Lebanon area, so closer to the sea. Beautiful land. It's already started giving juice. We were surprised as the quality of the juice after 3 years, which is relatively young for vines. But so we will see where that evolves.
And what's the idea about it? What is it going to be, a new label?
No. That will go. So we planted Merwah, which is the local white, because we were having issues finding Merwah, because we don't have it in our vineyards in the Bekaa Valley, and we used to rely on buying it from farmers. So we planted Merwah because we needed it, and we thought that the terroir was good for it, and it would resist a bit more to heat than reds. And we also planted a bit of Cinsault. And so all of that will go into the Chateau Musar wines. Chateau Musar we look for elegance, which we mentioned earlier, but we also look for complexity. and complexity comes from, your varietal mix, your terroir mix, your age of vine mix, and obviously the blending. So it's a bit of everything that builds your complexity. And so having a new terroir is actually good.
And Marc, what are we going to talk about in 5 years?
What are we going to talk about in 5 years? Well, hopefully,
other than peace in your
peace.
land.
I was about to say the first thing I was about to say, because this is always the concern. I was about to say peace. At Musar, what are we going to talk about in the next 5 years? Good question. So 5 years, a lot can happen in 5 years. I think we will have a bit of expansion at Musar. Obviously, we're always looking for new land. We've been trying to increase production, but it's been difficult because it's difficult to find either quality grapes or quality land. But I hope that we'll be able to have more available at that time. 5 years means also we'll be closer to starting to integrate maybe the fourth generation of the family. So we will see. It took me a long time before I joined the business. My brother has children who are, some are one is already in his 30s, so it's a possibility. So that's a potential change. And I think we'll probably have a slightly different setup because we have extra land next to our winery now. So just expanding not only production, but just the whole setup of how we do things, just improving, I guess, what we do. And then in the wines themselves, we've introduced already a new wine called Levantine, which is the wine with the Tempranillo component. At this stage, do we have new plans to add more different wines? No, not unless we find, sources of grapes that are reliable. If we do, then we'll decide what to do at that point in time. But otherwise, what I can see in our wines is global warming is still going to be an issue. So I see that maybe a little bit more Cinsault staying into these varietals because into the blends, just because they would resist better. But you never know. Nature is completely unpredictable, and so you can end up with a cycle that changes. Maybe 5 years is short, but you can end up with a few years that are a bit colder, where we don't get the heat waves, and therefore we'd end up with again vintages that are very different. So I don't know. That's the part where we don't know, but that's it's good not to know. I don't want to know exactly what's happening in 5 years. If I knew, then probably I'd be bored. So surprises are necessary to ensure that you're still keen and interested.
But we're gonna taste the 22 vintage in 5 years, probably, right?
In 5 years, we'll taste the 22 vintage, definitely.
What am I going to taste? How was the vintage 22?
Well, it's still too early. It's still too early to tell. 22. Well, we've just had 23, which I tasted a bit. 22 is so young, and we haven't even done the blend for the Chateau. So I can't really tell you much because because I'm not tasting the wines all the time. We only taste them when we blend them. Obviously, Tarek and Gaston, my brother, they taste them more regularly. I don't. So I don't have a very clear identity for the vintage of 22 yet versus the others. It's only a bit later that it starts to kick in for me. Even the Jeune red, we're not even on 22 vintage yet. So way too early yet. But if you come to the winery, Mate, one day, in the next year, then you can taste 22 with us, and you can taste Cabernet alone, Cinsault alone, and so it will give you an idea of the different varietals on their own before we actually get to the blend.
I already promised to visit you in October. I think as you, I'm waiting for the peace, and then I hope to experience your magical terroir and also taste your varieties next to each other. Can't wait to feel that vibration what your wines always emit and also always communicate. So I'm sure that your terroir will have a different impact on me.
And the wines will taste different in Lebanon. Even when we do the tour at the winery, we taste the wines in the cellar, and then we take the glass and then taste them outside. And then just the difference in temperature, difference in light, and everything then all tastes different from the same glass. When you're tasting, all your senses are involved and triggered, and so it's a complete combination of the environment and the wine, your palate, your mood. And so, going from a cellar at 20-30 meters under the ground in the dark and humidity to outdoors in the sun, just 30 meters above, just makes a big difference. And so you'll taste that difference there, but you'll also taste the wines differently compared to probably, even in a restaurant compared to when you taste them in Germany, because they'll be at home.
Yeah, I didn't expect nothing else, but just an honest and really thoughtful communication between us. I really like your company also as well in Germany, and I think it's very important work that you are doing, and showing also us sommeliers and also other winemakers that there are a lot of ways to create wines and create memorable wines, not always that you maybe study at Montpellier or in another institute. And thank you very much for your work.
No, thank you very much, Mate. I mean, we had a good conversation when we met back in September, and it's I think the questions you ask and the way you direct the conversation is interesting, because it goes beyond just pure technical side of wines, which I think is the boring part. And on the contrary, it looks as to what is the soul of wine, what justifies or explains wine, and how we interact with wine and what it brings to us. And so I think putting all of the context around wine that makes it a pleasurable experience and an insightful experience is good. And I think the conversations and the questions you asked were spot on to gear towards that. So bravo. And it was nice having a conversation.
Yeah, happy to hear that. And I see you in Lebanon after the peace has settled.
Yes. Hopefully, I mean, you can come probably from 2024. I wouldn't know exactly when in 2024, but at one point, definitely.
Cool. I see you there.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Marc.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Take care, Martin. Bye-bye.